She had spent 7 years learning how to disappear inside a marriage, ironing his shirts, memorizing his coffee order, shrinking her voice to a frequency he could comfortably ignore. And when he finally slid those divorce papers across the kitchen table and told her to stop being so damn dramatic, she looked down at her hands and quietly remembered that those hands could sign a check that would erase everything he had ever built. Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. I am Mr. Zaha. Thanks for tuning in today. A kind words from a man who has seen it all. Marriage are not mostly bed of roses. Sometime you need more of. More of what? Can't say. Continue watching, and you will surely know what to do in situations like this. Kindly hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow, I'll be bringing you another exciting story you definitely don't want to miss. So let's get started. The coffee maker beeped at 6:04 a.m., the same as it always did. Catherine Elise Weston, née Hale, though she hadn't gone by that in 7 years, was already awake. She had been awake since 5, lying on her side of the California King with her eyes open and the ceiling doing nothing useful above her, listening to the particular quality of silence that had taken up permanent residence in this house sometime around year 4 of her marriage and never left. She rose before the alarm. She always did. The house was a 5-bedroom colonial in Greenwich, Connecticut, the kind of house that appeared in real estate listings with words like stately and timeless and an entertainer's dream, which was ironic, Catherine always thought, because nothing that happened inside it lately felt like dreaming, and the only entertaining she did was the performance of a happy marriage at her husband's work functions, a role she had refined to something very close to art. She padded downstairs in bare feet, the hardwood cool and smooth beneath her, and started the coffee. French roast, black, no sugar. That was how her husband, Daniel Weston, took it. She knew his coffee order the way she knew the specific creak of the third stair, the way she knew which burner on the stove ran hot, the way you come to know the architecture of a life you inhabit completely, but somehow never fully own. She poured a mug for herself too, hers with a splash of cream, taken quietly at the kitchen island while the house was still hers, and the morning still held some small promise of peace. Outside the window, the Connecticut autumn was doing what it did best. The maple in the backyard had gone the color of an old ember, and the lawn was scattered with leaves that the landscaping crew would come to remove on Thursday, because Daniel had a very specific opinion about leaves on lawns. He had specific opinions about most things. That was, she had once found charming. That was, she had learned. The thing about people who have specific opinions, they tend to apply them to you eventually. She had met Daniel Weston at 26, at a fundraising gala in Manhattan that she had attended reluctantly, wearing a dress her mother had selected and nursing a glass of white wine she didn't particularly want. He had appeared beside her with the easy, undeniable confidence of a man who had decided early in life that every room he entered was already his. He was 32, self-made. Or so he always said, and he always said it. Worked it into conversation the way other men worked in sports scores. The founder of a mid-sized commercial real estate development firm that was, at the time, on a genuinely impressive upward trajectory. He was charming. God, he had been so charming. He had looked at her that night like she was the most interesting thing in the room, and after years of feeling pleasantly invisible, of slipping through spaces without particular notice, the sensation of being seen had been so startling and so warm that she had leaned into it completely, the way you lean into the first real heat of spring. They were married 14 months later. Her mother had cried at the wedding. Her father, retired, quiet, the kind of man who expressed love through practical provision and long silences, had shaken Daniel's hand and looked at Catherine with an expression she hadn't known how to read at the time. She understood it now. It had been the look of a man who sees something coming that he has decided his daughter must walk into on her own, because some lessons cannot be borrowed. Catherine's maiden name was Hale, as in Hale Capital Group, as in the private equity and asset management firm founded by her grandfather, Robert Hale Sr., in 1961, which had spent 6 decades quietly accumulating the kind of wealth that doesn't appear on Forbes lists because the people who hold it have the taste and the legal infrastructure to keep it exactly that way. She was the only child of Robert Hale Jr., who had grown the firm to something his father hadn't imagined, and who had spent the last 3 years, with the steady intention of a man putting his house in perfect order, transitioning control of that firm, its holdings, its trusts, its seats, its future, to his daughter. Catherine had been receiving emails about this transition for 8 months. She had answered 11 of them. The rest sat in a folder she had labeled, with the specific self-awareness of someone who knows exactly what she is avoiding. Dad. Handle later. It was not that she didn't understand what was waiting for her in that folder. She understood it with a precision that sometimes startled her when she let herself look at it directly. The way you're startled, looking into a mirror in strong light, to see yourself more clearly than you expected. She knew the numbers. She knew the scope. Her father's attorney, a composed and relentlessly thorough Boston man named Arthur Crane, had walked her through it in his office 6 months ago, across a mahogany table stacked with documents, speaking in the measured tones of someone who has delivered large numbers to unprepared people before and has learned to leave space for the weight to settle. She had sat across from Arthur Crane and been very still for a very long time. Then she had come home to Greenwich, made dinner, ironed a shirt, and not told her husband a single thing about it. Why hadn't she told him? She had asked herself this. Late at night, or in the quiet of the kitchen before he came downstairs, she had turned the question over the way you turn over a stone, looking at what lived underneath. The honest answer, the one she circled but rarely landed on, was that she already knew what Daniel would do with the information. She had watched him for 7 years. She knew the architecture of his ambitions the way she knew the architecture of this house. He would absorb it. He would reframe it, quietly, gradually, with great strategic warmth, until her inheritance became his leverage, her family's legacy became his next development project, and she became, even more thoroughly than she already was, a supporting character in a story with his name on the cover. And she couldn't bear that. She wasn't sure she could bear much more of what she already had, honestly. The distance between them had not arrived all at once. It had come the way seasons change, imperceptibly, gradually, and then suddenly, undeniably, you look up and the thing that was green is bare. He had stopped asking about her days somewhere around year 3. He had stopped coming to her family's Christmas gatherings in year 4, always with a reason that was technically valid and somehow always available. He spoke over her at dinner parties with the practiced fluency of someone who doesn't realize they're doing it, which was almost worse than if he had. He had built, in 7 years, a life in which she was essential and invisible in equal measure, necessary for the appearance of the thing, irrelevant to its actual operation. And she had let him. That was the part she couldn't talk around, couldn't file under his failings and leave there comfortably. She had made herself small. No one had forced her hands into this shape. She had folded herself, carefully and repeatedly, because it was easier than the conversation that unfolding would require. She was tired of easy. She stood at the kitchen island with her cream-touched coffee and looked out at the ember-colored maple and thought, not for the first time, about a folder on her laptop called Dad. Handle later. Upstairs, she heard the alarm go off. She heard Daniel silence it. She heard the measured, unhurried footsteps of a man who had never once in 7 years of mornings come downstairs and said you didn't have to do that when he found the coffee already made and waiting. She poured his mug. She set it at his end of the table. She sat down at hers. And outside, the Connecticut morning held its breath. Have you ever stayed quiet about who you really were just to keep the peace? Tell me in the comments, you are not alone. He came home from Chicago on a Wednesday. Catherine had not expected him until Thursday. He had said Thursday, definitively, the way Daniel said most things, as though the calendar itself wouldn't dare argue. But she heard the garage door at 7:40 p.m. while she was sitting in the living room with a book she hadn't been reading, and she felt the particular shift in her chest that had become her body's automatic response to his arrival. Not excitement, not quite dread, something in between, a bracing, a subtle drawing inward, the way you unconsciously square your shoulders before stepping into a cold wind. She heard him set his keys on the entryway table. She heard the particular drag of his rolling suitcase across the hardwood. She heard him go to the kitchen, open the refrigerator, close it. She heard him pour a drink. She did not hear him call her name. He appeared in the living room doorway with a glass of bourbon and the loosened tie of a man who has made a decision on an airplane and spent the descent rehearsing it. You're home early, Catherine said. Flight moved up. He didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway in that way he had, occupying a threshold without fully entering, as though he were always half deciding whether the room was worth his complete presence. He looked at her with an expression she didn't immediately recognize, which was unusual. After 7 years, she knew his expressions the way she knew the house, every corner, every room. But this one was different. Arranged. Deliberate. Prepared. "We need to talk," he said. The divorce papers were in his briefcase. She would think about that later, would think about it in the specific, recurring way your mind returns to a detail that contains more horror the longer you examine it. He had carried them onto the plane in Chicago. He had sat with them in the overhead compartment for the duration of the flight, somewhere above the clouds between O'Hare and Westchester, while the flight attendant offered drinks, and the other passengers read or slept or stared at their phones, ordinary and unbothered, unaware that in seat 3B a man was rehearsing the end of his marriage like a quarterly earnings call. He set them on the coffee table between them, a manila envelope, unmarked, the kind of envelope that looked like nothing until it was everything. Catherine looked at it. Then she looked at him. "Daniel, I've had the papers drawn up," he said. He had settled into the armchair across from her, her father's armchair, actually, a broad leather wingback that Robert Hale Jr. had given them as a housewarming gift, which Daniel had always loved without ever acknowledging where it came from. "I think we both know this hasn't been working for a long time." The book was still in her hands. She realized this, the absurdity of it, her fingers still holding the page, and set it down on the cushion beside her with a care that had nothing to do with the book. "You had papers drawn up," she said. "Catherine, when—" Her voice was very quiet. She was aware of keeping it that way. "When did you have them drawn up?" He exhaled through his nose, that particular exhale, the one that meant he found the question inefficient. "That's not the point. It's a little bit the point, Daniel." "The point," he said, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, the posture of a man delivering a presentation he's confident in, "is that we have been living like roommates for 2 years. Polite, functional roommates who don't particularly enjoy each other's company. You know that. I know that. Drawing it out isn't. It doesn't serve either of us." She sat with that for a moment. The fireplace was going. She had lit it earlier, before she knew he was coming home, before any of this, in some previous version of the evening that now felt almost laughably innocent. The fire crackled and threw warm light across the room, indifferent to the conversation happening inside it. "So your solution," she said carefully, "is divorce." "My solution is honesty." He said it with the conviction of someone who had workshopped the phrasing. "Something we haven't been great at. You want to talk to me about honesty, Catherine?" And there it was, that tone. The tone that arrived when he felt the conversation slipping out of the clean, logical shape he'd built for it. Patient. Patronizing. The tone of a man explaining something to someone he has decided is being deliberately obtuse. "I need you to not make this into a whole." "A whole what?" "A whole thing." He gestured, a vague, circular motion of the bourbon glass that somehow managed to encompass her, her emotions, the fire, the room, the entire inconvenience of her interiority. "I need you to be reasonable about this." She stared at him. 7 years sat in the room between them like a guest no one had invited. She picked up the envelope. She didn't know why she did it. Some automatic impulse, the habitual reaching of a woman who had spent 7 years handling the things put in front of her. She turned it over in her hands. It was heavier than she expected, or maybe it wasn't heavy at all, and she was simply feeling the weight differently now. "These are already prepared," she said, half to herself. "Yes. You went to an attorney. In Chicago." A brief pause. "Does it matter where?" "You planned this trip," she said slowly. "Or at least, you made this decision before the trip. You went to Chicago with this already decided." He didn't deny it. He took a drink of bourbon instead, and the not denying was its own kind of answer, sitting in the room as plainly as the papers in her hands. Something moved through her then. It started in her sternum and spread outward. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but some compound of both that she didn't have a clean word for. 7 years of mornings. 7 years of coffee at the right temperature and smiles at the right moments, and a voice kept carefully at the right volume, so as not to disturb the careful structure of his comfort. 7 years of folding herself smaller and smaller, and he had, quietly, efficiently, on a business trip, folded her out entirely. "I'd like you to sign them soon," Daniel said. "Arthur, my attorney, says there's no reason this needs to be prolonged. We don't have children." The asset division is straightforward. He said the last part with the brisk confidence of a man who has reviewed the math and is satisfied with it. And Catherine, holding the envelope, feeling the weight of it, something shifting in her chest that she couldn't yet name, thought, he has no idea. He had no idea. I think, she said, and her voice came out so steady it surprised her, that you may want to slow down. Catherine, the tone again. Please don't do this. Don't do what? Don't make this dramatic. He set the bourbon glass down. Don't turn this into something it doesn't need to be. It's paperwork. It's a legal process. It doesn't have to be a scene. Stop being so damn dramatic. Those words, that particular arrangement, that dismissal dressed up as reasonableness, landed somewhere specific inside her. Not on her skin, where things could be brushed off. Deeper than that. In the place where she kept the things she had quietly been collecting for 7 years. Every unacknowledged morning, every talked-over sentence, every Christmas he hadn't come to, every room he had entered and made immediately and entirely about himself. They landed there, those words, and something that had been very still for a very long time moved. She set the envelope back on the coffee table. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, with the clear, unhurried attention of someone who has just decided something and is no longer afraid of what comes next. I'll have my attorney look at these, she said. Of course, he said, relieved, already reaching for his bourbon. That's all I'm asking. Just be. My attorney, she said quietly, is Arthur Crane. She watched him. She watched the name land. She watched the slight, involuntary stillness that crossed his face. There and gone in less than a second. But there, undeniably there, because even Daniel Weston, in all his careful preparation, had made one critical miscalculation. He had never once, in 7 years, asked her father's name. The moment you realize you've been underestimated by the one person who should have known better, drop a fire in the comments. This story just got started. Arthur Crane's office was on the 34th floor of a building on Boylston Street in Boston that had no signage on the exterior, no listing in the lobby directory, and no website that a casual search would find. This was intentional. The firms that occupied the upper floors of that building had spent generations cultivating the specific kind of anonymity that only extraordinary wealth can afford. The understanding that if you need to advertise, you haven't yet arrived at the level where advertising becomes unnecessary. Catherine had been coming to this office since she was 14 years old. She sat across from Arthur Crane on a Thursday morning, 48 hours after Daniel had set the manila envelope on the coffee table, and she looked at the man who had managed her family's legal affairs for 23 years with the expression of someone who has finally, after a long detour, returned to a place they should never have left. Arthur Crane was 71, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had never been particularly warm, but had always been absolutely trustworthy. The face of a man whose entire professional identity was built on the understanding that discretion and precision were not complementary virtues, but the same virtue, expressed differently, depending on the day. He looked at her across the mahogany table and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I was wondering when you'd come. I should have come sooner, Catherine said. Yes, he agreed, without cruelty. You should have. She set Daniel's manila envelope on the table between them. Arthur glanced at it without touching it, the way a surgeon glances at an X-ray, reading it, cataloging it, already 3 steps ahead. He had them drawn up in Chicago, she said. I don't know the attorney. I'll find out, Arthur said. He still hadn't touched the envelope. Before we discuss this, and we will discuss it thoroughly, I need to know where you are with the other matter. Catherine folded her hands on the table. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston spread gray and gold beneath an autumn sky, the Charles River catching light in the distance like a long, slow exhale. I'm ready, she said. Arthur Crane looked at her for a moment with those careful, unreadable eyes. Then, for the first time in 23 years of professional composure, he allowed himself a very small smile. Then, he said, opening the leather portfolio in front of him, let's begin. The numbers took 40 minutes to walk through properly. Catherine had seen them before, in pieces and fragments, in the carefully compartmentalized way she had been allowing herself to approach them, the way you approach a very bright light, gradually, incrementally, until your eyes adjust. But sitting across from Arthur Crane, in that quiet, precise room above Boston, with his measured voice moving through the holdings and the trusts and the portfolio valuations and the board structures. She let herself see it whole for the first time. Hale Capital Group. Founded 1961. 63 years of accumulated, managed, quietly compounding wealth. Real estate holdings across 11 states. A private equity arm with positions in 32 companies. A charitable foundation that operated with more efficiency than most corporations. And at the center of it, the trust, restructured 18 months ago by her father with the specific and deliberate intention of passing primary control to his only child. To her, the net figure, when Arthur finally said it aloud, settled into the room the way large things settle, not with drama, but with a kind of immovable, gravitational calm. Catherine sat with it. She thought about the kitchen in Greenwich, the coffee at the right temperature, the unread emails in the folder called Dad, handle later. She thought about Daniel in his armchair, her father's armchair, with his bourbon and his prepared speech and his manila envelope, so thoroughly confident in his understanding of the landscape that it had never once occurred to him to question whether he was reading the right map. He doesn't know, Arthur said. It wasn't a question. No. You never told him. No. Arthur nodded slowly, without judgment. And the divorce papers. How do you want to proceed? Catherine looked out at the Charles River for a moment. The light on the water was very clear. I want you to review every asset he believes is jointly held, she said. I want to know exactly what he thinks he's entitled to, and I want to know precisely, Arthur, what he actually is. That, Arthur said, uncapping his pen, will be my pleasure. She drove back to Greenwich in the early afternoon, through the particular beauty of a New England fall that felt, today, less like scenery and more like punctuation. The trees along I-95 burned orange and red and gold, and Catherine drove through them with both hands on the wheel, and something unfamiliar but not unwelcome expanding steadily in her chest. It felt, she thought, like oxygen, like the specific sensation of breathing deeply after a long time of breathing carefully. She had been so careful for so long. Daniel was at the house when she got back. He was in his office, the room at the end of the hall that he had claimed in the first month of their marriage with the efficiency of a man who understands the tactical value of established territory. On a phone call, door half open, pacing the way he paced when the call was significant. She heard fragments as she passed. Timeline needs to move up. Not a problem, the Greenwich property alone. She paused, stood in the hallway, very still. Once the divorce is finalized, the asset restructuring is straightforward. I've already spoken to Morrison about the development rights. She stood there for 3 full seconds. Then she walked to the kitchen, set down her bag, and filled a glass of water with the steady hands of a woman who has just received a piece of information that transforms confusion into clarity. He had already spoken to someone about the development rights. To the Greenwich property. Their home. The home her father had helped them purchase. The home she had spent 7 years filling with the small, invisible labor of a woman making a life, was already a line item in a post-divorce development plan that he had apparently been building before the ink on the manila envelope was dry. She drank the water slowly. She thought about the armchair in the living room. Her father's armchair. That evening they moved around each other with the careful, practiced distance of people sharing a space that is already, in every way that matters, ceased to be shared. Daniel made himself dinner without asking if she'd eaten. She sat at the kitchen island with her laptop and opened, for the first time in 8 months, every email in the folder called Dad, handle later. She read them all. She replied to 3. At 9:15, Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway. Have you looked at the papers? He asked. I have an attorney reviewing them, she said, without looking up from the screen. Catherine, the tone, patient, patronizing, the particular register of a man who has confused his wife's gentleness for a permanent condition rather than a choice. It's a straightforward process. The longer you wait, the more drawn out this gets. I'm trying to make this easy. She looked up then. She looked at him across the kitchen, across the marble island and the French roast coffee maker and 7 years of mornings, with an expression that was new. Not angry, not wounded. Something cleaner than either of those. Awake. You've been very considerate, she said. Something in her tone made him pause. A flicker crossed his face, not quite the stillness that had crossed it when she'd mentioned Arthur Crane's name, but adjacent to it. A small, involuntary recalibration. I'm just saying, he started. I know what you're saying, Daniel. She closed the laptop. She looked at him with the clear, unhurried eyes of a woman who has spent the day sitting across from Arthur Crane in a room above the Charles River and has come home knowing, with perfect precision, exactly where she stands. I want you to know that I'm taking this very seriously. I'm giving it exactly the attention it deserves. He studied her for a moment. Good, he said finally. That's all I want. He went upstairs. She opened the laptop again. There was an email from her father, sent that afternoon from his home in Nantucket. Robert Hale Jr., 74 years old, sharp as winter, quiet as deep water, who had built an empire by understanding that the most powerful move is the one your opponent doesn't see coming. The email contained 4 words. Whenever you're ready, sweetheart. She stared at those 4 words for a long time. Then she typed back 2. I'm ready. And pressed send. The moment she pressed send, did you feel that? Tell me what you felt in the comments. I need to know. The call came on a Monday morning. Daniel was in the kitchen, standing, as he always stood, as though the act of sitting implied a leisure he was too important to afford, scrolling through his phone with one hand and reaching for his coffee with the other, when his own attorney, a sharp and generally unflappable man named Greg Morrison, called him for the 3rd time in 2 days. Catherine was at the kitchen table. She had been there when Daniel came downstairs, which was unusual. Normally she was moving, making things, arranging things, performing the quiet industry of a woman who has learned to justify her presence through productivity. But this morning she was simply sitting, both hands wrapped around her coffee mug, watching the backyard where the last of the autumn leaves were coming down in slow, unhurried spirals. She heard Daniel answer. She didn't look up. Morrison. Daniel's voice carried the easy authority of a man taking a call he expects to control. Yeah, I've been waiting to hear back. What's the status on the asset review? A pause. Catherine watched a leaf detach from the maple and fall. What do you mean, complicated? Daniel said. Another pause. Longer this time. What trust? What are you talking about? His voice had shifted. Barely perceptibly, the way a foundation shifts before anyone sees the crack in the wall, but Catherine heard it. She had spent 7 years learning the acoustics of this man. Run that by me again. Slowly. She lifted her coffee mug and took a slow, quiet sip. It took Greg Morrison approximately 12 minutes to walk Daniel through what Arthur Crane had spent the previous 4 days meticulously, methodically, and with obvious professional satisfaction assembling. Catherine did not hear all of it. She wasn't meant to. Daniel had moved to the far end of the kitchen, then to the hallway. Then, as the conversation progressed, and his voice dropped from its normal register into something lower and more effortful, to his office at the end of the hall, the door closing behind him with a click that was trying very hard to be controlled. She heard enough. She heard Hale Capital Group through the wall. She heard how long and why didn't anyone, and then a silence long enough to mean that Morrison was explaining something that required silence to absorb. She set her mug down. She looked out at the maple. Her grandfather, Robert Hale Sr., had planted a maple tree in the yard of every home he ever owned. She hadn't thought about that in years, hadn't thought about it until right now. Sitting in the kitchen of a house in Greenwich, Connecticut, watching the last leaves of October come down, and realizing that the reason she had loved this yard from the first moment Daniel had brought her to see this house was the maple tree. She had thought, at the time, that it was just a tree. She understood now that it was a memory she hadn't recognized yet. That some part of her, deeper than the part that had been learning to make herself small, had seen that tree and felt, in a wordless and cellular way, like she was home. Her grandfather had known what he was doing. Her father had known what he was doing. Now it was her turn. Daniel came out of his office 22 minutes after he had gone in. She heard his footsteps in the hallway, and they were different. This was the first thing she noticed. 7 years of his footsteps in this house, and she knew every variation. The brisk, purposeful stride of a man running on schedule, the heavier tread of a bad day, the particular rhythm of a man who is about to want something from her. These footsteps were none of those. These were the footsteps of a man who has had the floor shift beneath him and is walking carefully because he is no longer entirely certain what is solid. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the same clear, unhurried expression she had been assembling for the past 4 days. Not cold, not triumphant, but steady. The expression of a woman who has found her footing and is not planning to lose it again. "Catherine," he said. "Good morning," she said. He came into the kitchen slowly and sat down. Actually sat down, which Daniel almost never did in the mornings, at the kitchen table, 2 seats away from her. He set his phone face down on the table. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at her. "Morrison tells me," he said, "that your father's firm has, that there's a trust." He stopped. "Reorganized. Why didn't you tell me?" "Tell you what specifically?" "Catherine." Not the tone, this time. Something different, stripped of the patronizing patience, stripped of the management. Raw almost. The voice of a man who has been moving confidently through a room he now realizes he never had a map for. The Hale Capital Group. The trust. All of it. Why didn't you tell me any of it? She considered the question genuinely. It deserved a genuine answer. "Because," she said, "I already knew what you would do with it." He flinched. It was small, and he recovered quickly, but she saw it. "That's not fair," he said. "I heard you on the phone last week," she said. "Not accusatory. Simply factual, the way you state a thing that has already happened and cannot be rearranged. The call about the development rights. The Greenwich property. Morrison, you were planning the asset restructuring before you had even given me the papers." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard in this kitchen. Daniel looked at the table. His jaw worked slightly. That specific movement, the one that meant he was solving a problem, recalculating, looking for the angle that returned him to advantage. She had watched him do it in business meetings and dinner party arguments and every disagreement they had ever had. She had always, before now, felt something contract in her when he did it, some anticipatory bracing, a preemptive apology forming in her throat. She felt none of that now. "The firm," he said finally, his voice careful and reconfigured. "Morrison says, it's significant, Catherine. It's very significant. I don't. I want to understand why you kept this from me." "You want to understand it," she said. "Or you want to change it?" He looked at her sharply. "Because those are different questions," she said. "And I need to know which one you're actually asking." What happened next would stay with her. Not because of what he said, though what he said mattered, but because of the moment just before he said it, when Daniel Weston, whom she had watched occupy every room he ever entered with the complete and unquestioned confidence of a man who has never once doubted his own gravity, sat across from her in a kitchen in Connecticut, with his phone face down on the table and the last maple leaves coming down outside, and looked at her with something she had never seen in his face before in 7 years. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty. The kind that has no performance in it, no strategy waiting behind it. The look of a man who has arrived at the edge of something he built without foundations and is only now feeling the give beneath his feet. "I made a mistake," he said. She waited. Not just the papers. He pressed his fingers against the table, a gesture she recognized as his version of reaching for steadiness. "The way I've been, the way I treated this. He stopped. She watched him resist the urge to reframe it, to sand it into something more manageable. She watched him resist it and lose. "I've been an arrogant idiot, Catherine." It was not a grand confession. It was not the speech of a man who had rehearsed his remorse. It was halting and insufficient and real, and it landed on her differently than any prepared speech could have, precisely because of those qualities. She looked at him. She thought about 7 years. She thought about mornings and coffee and the study she wasn't allowed to call hers. She thought about a folder called Dad, handle later, and an armchair from her father, and a maple tree in the backyard that she now understood she had always recognized. She thought about what it would cost to stay and what it would cost to go, and she understood, sitting in the full and quiet knowledge of who she was and what she carried, that she was no longer making either decision from a place of smallness. She was choosing from a place of power, and that changed everything about the choice. "You have a lot," she said slowly, "to answer for, Daniel. I know. I'm not talking about the money." "I know," he said again, quieter. "I know that." Outside, the last maple leaf of October came down. "I'm not talking about the money." "Which line hit you the hardest? Drop it in the comments below." 3 weeks passed. They were the strangest 3 weeks of Catherine Weston's life, stranger, even, than the early weeks of her marriage, when everything had been new and bright, and she had been so busy becoming Mrs. Weston that she hadn't noticed what she was quietly setting down. These 3 weeks were strange in a different way. Quieter. More deliberate. Like the particular stillness of a house after a storm has moved through it. The air changed, the light different, everything rearranged just slightly from where it had been before, so that you move through familiar rooms with new attention, noticing things you had long since stopped seeing. She had not signed the papers. Daniel had not asked her to again. They existed in the house together with a careful, tentative quality that was nothing like the comfortable distance of before, that had been the distance of two people who had stopped trying. This was different. This was the distance of two people who were, for perhaps the first time in years, actually paying attention to each other. Watching, measuring, trying to locate, beneath the accumulated weight of 7 years of habits and silences and small surrenders, whether there was still something worth the excavation. Catherine had moved her work to the kitchen table. This was, in its quiet way, a declaration. The study, her study, which she now called her study, aloud, without apology, remained hers. But the kitchen table had always been contested territory, a space she had occupied only in service of things that needed doing, never simply as a place where she had a right to be and work and exist without justification. She brought her laptop to the kitchen table on the first Monday of those 3 weeks and opened it and began answering emails. And when Daniel came downstairs and found her there, she looked up and met his eyes and did not move. He poured his own coffee. He sat at his end of the table. He opened his own laptop, and they worked, side by side and 3 feet apart, in a silence that was nothing like the silences before. This one had texture, awareness in it, the specific quality of two people relearning the simple, radical act of being in the same room and meaning it. Her father came to Greenwich on a Wednesday. Robert Hale Jr. drove himself, which he always did despite his age and his cardiologist's ongoing and ignored suggestions to the contrary, arriving in a dark green Range Rover that was 12 years old because he saw no reason to replace something that worked. He was a tall man, slightly stooped now at 74, with gray hair and her same eyes, the particular shade of gray-green that Catherine had spent her whole life seeing in mirrors and only recently, looking at photographs of him as a young man, understood was entirely his. He came into the kitchen and looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened his arms, and she walked into them, and stood there with her face against the shoulder of his old wool coat, while he held her with the steady, uncomplicated certainty of a man who has loved his daughter without condition for 38 years and intends to continue indefinitely. "You took your time," he said into her hair. "I know, Dad. You're here now. I'm here now." He pulled back and looked at her face with those careful eyes, reading her the way he had always read her. Not the surface of her, not the performance, but the actual thing beneath. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once, the small decisive nod of a man who has been waiting for a particular outcome and has now confirmed its arrival. "Good," he said. "Let's have coffee." Daniel came home that evening to find Robert Hale Jr. at his kitchen table. Catherine watched her husband walk into that room and process the situation with the specific, visible recalibration of a man encountering something he had not prepared for. Her father looked up from his coffee mug with the unhurried attention of a man who has never needed a room's approval and extended his hand across the table. "Daniel," he said, "sit down." It was not a request. Daniel sat. What followed was not a confrontation. Robert Hale Jr. did not do confrontations, had never needed to, had built 60 years of success on the understanding that a man who is entirely clear about who he is never needs to raise his voice to be heard. It was, instead, a conversation. Long, direct, and honest in the way that only conversations between people who have dispensed entirely with pretense can be. Her father spoke about Catherine, about who she was before she became Mrs. Weston, not as an accusation but as information, the filling in of a portrait Daniel had been looking at for 7 years without knowing the full image. He spoke about the firm, about the trust, about the responsibility that came with it, and the woman he had spent a lifetime quietly preparing to carry it. He spoke about what he had observed from a careful distance over 7 years of a marriage he had concerns about and had chosen, because he respected his daughter, not to interfere with. And then he stopped speaking, and he looked at Daniel Weston with those gray-green eyes, and he said, with perfect and unembellished simplicity, "The question I'm interested in is not what you didn't know. The question is what you do with what you know now." Daniel was quiet for a long time. Catherine, sitting across the table, watched her husband in the particular way she had been watching him for 3 weeks, looking for the recalculation, the angle, the strategic realignment of a man finding the position of advantage in new terrain. She watched for it, and was prepared for it, and had already decided, quietly and clearly in the privacy of herself, what it would mean if she found it. She didn't find it. What she found instead, in Daniel's face, was something she had seen only once before, in the kitchen, on that Monday morning, when he had set his phone face down on the table and the floor had shifted beneath him. That unguarded, unstrategic, unperformed thing that she had not known his face was capable of until it appeared there involuntarily. "I've been selfish," Daniel said. He was looking at her father, but the words were for her. I built something I was proud of, and I think somewhere along the way I started measuring everything against that, including Catherine, especially Catherine." He paused. She deserved better than that. She deserved someone who saw her, not a supporting role in his own story. Robert Hale Jr. regarded him for a moment. "That," her father said, "is the most accurate thing you've said since I walked in." Her father left at 9. He hugged Catherine at the door, held her for a moment the same way he had in the kitchen, and said quietly, for only her, "The directorship is yours when you want it. Take the time you need. But Catherine, take the time you need for you. Not for anyone else." She nodded. "You were never small," he said. "Not for a single day of your life. Don't let anyone make you forget that again. Not even yourself." She watched the dark green Range Rover back down the driveway and disappear into the Connecticut night. She stood at the door for a moment in the cold air, the stars very clear above the bare trees, the neighborhood quiet in the particular way of New England autumn nights, as if the world had drawn a breath and was holding it. She went back inside. Daniel was in the kitchen, washing the coffee mugs, both hands in the warm water, sleeves rolled up, doing a simple domestic thing in the kitchen of their home, and she stood in the doorway and looked at him and felt the full, complex, unresolvable truth of 7 years between them, the hurt of it and the history of it and the waste of it, but also, beneath all of that, something that the hurt and the history and the waste had not, she realized, actually managed to extinguish. Something that was still, despite everything, there. He turned and found her watching him. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. He dried his hands on the dish towel. He looked at her with those recalibrated eyes that had been learning, for 3 weeks, to actually see her. "I want to start over," he said. I don't mean pretend the last 7 years didn't happen. I mean, I want to do this right. If you'll let me. I want to know who you actually are." Catherine leaned against the doorframe. She thought about a folder called Dad, handle later. She thought about 43 unread emails and a study she had learned to call hers, and a maple tree in the backyard that had always been a memory she hadn't recognized yet. She thought about the woman who had made herself small, and the woman who had driven to Boston, and the woman who had pressed send on 2 words that had changed the direction of everything. She thought about what her father had said at the door. "You were never small. I'll make you a deal," she said. He waited. "You want to know who I actually am?" she said. "Then I need you to understand something first. I am not a supporting role. I am not a line item in an asset restructuring. I am not the woman who makes the coffee at the right temperature and disappears into the background of your life." She held his gaze without effort, without strain, the way you hold something you have finally remembered how to carry. "I am Catherine Elise Hale, and I have work to do in this world that matters. And whoever stands next to me while I do it needs to be standing with me, not in front of me, not managing me." She paused. "With me." The kitchen was very quiet. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Looked at her the way, she thought, he had looked at her at that fundraising gala in Manhattan 11 years ago, when she had been standing at the edge of the room, and he had appeared beside her and looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. Except this time it was real. This time he was seeing her. Not the performance of her, not the version of her that had been made convenient for his life. Her. The actual her. Catherine Elise Hale, who had been standing inside this marriage the whole time, waiting to be found. "Okay," he said, quietly, completely. "Okay, Catherine." She crossed the kitchen. She picked up a dish towel and stood beside him at the sink, and together, in the quiet of a Connecticut night with the maple tree standing bare and patient in the backyard and the stars very clear above the old colonial house, they finished washing the dishes. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a dramatic reconciliation scored with swelling music. It was two people standing shoulder to shoulder doing a small, ordinary thing, but doing it together, this time, without distance, without performance, without anyone making themselves smaller than they were. It was, Catherine thought, exactly the right place to begin. 6 weeks later, on a clear December morning, Catherine Elise Hale. She had taken her name back, quietly and without announcement, and Daniel had said nothing except okay, and then, a day later, it suits you, sat at a long conference table on the 34th floor of a building on Boylston Street in Boston, and signed her name to the directorship documents that Arthur Crane set before her. Her father sat beside her. He did not say anything when she signed. He simply placed his hand over hers for a moment. That large, quiet hand that had held hers across streets when she was small, that had handed her a diploma and a set of car keys, and, once, on a Tuesday afternoon in the same conference room 11 years ago, a single sheet of paper that was the first document of the Hale family trust bearing her name. And he held it for just a moment. Then he let go. The way you let go of something you have prepared and protected and loved long enough to release into its own strength. Arthur Crane capped his pen. He looked across the table at the new director of Hale Capital Group, 38 years old, gray-green eyes, hands that were steady and certain and no longer in the business of making themselves small, and allowed himself, for the second time in 23 years, a very small smile. "Welcome," he said, to the chair. Daniel was waiting in the lobby downstairs. He had driven her to Boston that morning without being asked, had found parking without complaint, had said take all the time you need without the subtext of management in it, had sat in the lobby of a building with no signage and no website with a coffee. He'd brought her from the place on Newberry Street that she liked, not the French roast, not his order, but hers, with the splash of cream, and he stood when she came out of the elevator and handed it to her without ceremony. She took it. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the eyes of a man who is in the early, earnest, sometimes clumsy work of becoming someone worthy of the person standing in front of him, which is some of the most important work a person can do, and some of the hardest, and he was doing it, imperfectly and genuinely, one day at a time. "How'd it go?" he said. "It went well," she said. He nodded. He held the door. She walked through it into the December morning, into the clean, cold Boston air, into the beginning of a life she was choosing with her whole self, from a place of power and clarity and the hard-won, unshakable knowledge of her own worth. Behind her, the building on Boylston Street stood quiet and unmarked, holding its history the way old wealth holds everything, without advertisement, without apology. And ahead of her, the city opened wide. You were never small. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone, if it made you feel something you needed to feel today, leave a comment below. Tell me which moment stayed with you. This story was written for everyone who has ever made themselves smaller than they are. You were never small. Not for a single day. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.